Montana Territory, 1877. In a land where mountains cast long shadows over valleys of untamed promise, Mason Steele knew one truth with ironclad certainty. A man who opened his heart on the frontier was a fool begging for an early grave. The West had no patience for sentiment, and neither did he. Mason wiped the trail dust from his face as he dismounted his dun-quarter horse at the edge of the small creek. At 26, his lean, weather-toughened frame bore the marks of a man who'd spent the better part of his youth in the saddle. The sun had etched fine lines at the corners of his blue eyes, though his clean-shaven jaw and the occasional dimpled smile still betrayed his youth when he forgot himself enough to reveal it. "Come on, Thunder," he murmured, leading his horse to drink, long way ahead before nightfall. The sprawling cattle ranch that employed him lay nearly a day's ride east, but Mason had volunteered for this 3-day scouting mission to chart new grazing territory. The truth was, he preferred the solitude. Bunkhouse camaraderie felt hollow when a man was determined to keep his own counsel. He'd learned early that attachment was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. His father had taught him that lesson 10 years prior, when a Sioux raid had taken his mother while his father was away trading. His father, once a laughing, vibrant man, had withered into a shell before Mason's eyes. "Love is a noose," his father had told him before drinking himself to an early grave. "You hang yourself with it out here." Mason had built his life around that warning. He worked hard, saved his money, and planned to claim his own parcel of land someday, alone. No wife to mourn, no child to orphan, no heart to shatter when the untamed West inevitably exacted its price. After watering his horse, Mason mounted again, following the creek's winding path toward a stand of cottonwoods that promised evening shelter. The late afternoon sun cast the landscape in amber hues, and despite himself, Mason couldn't help admiring the wild beauty of this territory. Perhaps that was the one thing he allowed himself to love. A sudden movement caught his eye, something unnatural among the trees ahead. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Out here, hesitation was as deadly as carelessness. As he drew closer, the sound reached him before his eyes could make sense of what he was seeing. Weeping, unmistakably human and undeniably female, Mason frowned. Women were scarce in these parts, and a lone woman even more rare. He slowed Thunder to a cautious walk, approaching the cottonwood grove with measured wariness. Through the trees, he finally glimpsed the source, a young woman in a once fine dress of pale blue cotton, now travel-stained and torn at the hem. She sat on a fallen log, her back to him, shoulders shaking with each muffled sob. Beside her lay a small valise, its contents partially spilled onto the ground as though rifled through in haste. His instincts screamed danger. Distress this far from civilization usually meant trouble, and trouble was exactly what Mason had built his life to avoid. He could simply turn away, find another spot to camp for the night. Whatever calamity had befallen this woman wasn't his concern, and yet he couldn't make himself leave. "Ma'am," he called out, keeping Thunder at a respectful distance, "are you in need of assistance?" The woman startled violently, spinning around with wide, tear-streaked eyes. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with honey-blonde hair escaping what had once been an elegant bun. Her face, despite being blotched from crying, struck Mason with its delicate beauty. But it was the raw fear in her eyes that caught him off guard, like a cornered animal expecting only further harm. "Stay back," she warned, her voice quavering as she fumbled in her skirts and produced a small Derringer pistol that looked too large for her trembling hand. Mason immediately raised both hands. "I mean no harm, miss. I'm just a cowhand passing through. Name's Mason Steele." The pistol didn't waver. "How do I know you're not with them?" "With who, ma'am?" "The men who attacked our wagon. The ones who," her voice broke and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "The ones who killed my uncle." Mason slowly removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I've been riding alone for 3 days scouting grazing land for the Triple R Ranch. Haven't seen another soul until you." Something in his steady gaze, or perhaps the simple sincerity in his voice, seemed to reach her. The pistol lowered slightly. "I'm Jessica Harlow," she said after a moment. "We were traveling to Helena. My uncle and he was bringing me to meet my fiancé." Mason nodded, keeping his distance. "What happened to your wagon, Miss Harlow?" "3 men, they wanted our horses, our supplies. Uncle Henry tried to," she shook her head, unable to finish. "I ran when the shooting started. I've been hiding since yesterday morning." Montana nights could kill as surely as any bullet, especially with rain threatening in those gathering clouds. Whatever Mason's rules about involvement, he couldn't leave her here. Miss Harlow, I can escort you to Helena, or back to the nearest settlement if you prefer, but we should find proper shelter before nightfall. Jessica's gaze moved beyond him, scanning the empty plains as though expecting pursuit. Why would you help me? You don't know me. The question was fair, and Mason struggled to articulate an answer that made sense even to himself. Because out here, sometimes all we have is the decency we show each other. I can't promise anything beyond safe passage to where you need to go. Something in Jessica's expression shifted, not quite trust, but perhaps the recognition that she had few options. Helena, she said finally, I need to reach Helena. Mason nodded, we'll need to share a horse. Thunder's strong enough to carry us both, until we can find you proper transportation. As he helped Jessica gather her scattered belongings, a folded paper fell from her valise, a daguerreotype photograph of a stern-faced older man in formal attire. She quickly snatched it up, tucking it securely away. My fiancé, she explained, noticing Mason's glance. Judge Thomas Blackwell, he's a prominent man in Helena. Mason offered only a non-committal nod as he helped her mount Thunder, then swung up behind her. He was careful to maintain as much proper distance as the saddle allowed, but he could still detect the faint scent of lavender beneath the dust of her travels. We'll make a few miles before dark, he said, urging Thunder forward. Then find a defensible spot to camp. As they rode, Jessica sat rigid in the saddle before him, her back never relaxing against his chest despite the increasingly uneven terrain. Mason kept his thoughts to himself, but one reality was inescapable. Escorting a beautiful, frightened woman to meet her fiancé in Helena would thoroughly disrupt his carefully constructed solitude. The rules that had guided him for 10 years were clear: stay uninvolved, depend on no one, offer nothing that couldn't be easily abandoned. Yet here he was, with a tearful bride-to-be, and the strange, unwelcome sensation that his well-ordered existence was about to be upended entirely. By the third day of their journey, the tension between them had eased into something resembling cautious companionship. They'd fallen into the rhythm of travelers with a shared purpose, if not a shared destination. Each night, Mason had maintained strict propriety, setting up Jessica's bedroll far from his own, building the fire between them as both warmth and boundary. You never mentioned what brought you out west, Jessica remarked that evening as she stirred the rabbit stew Mason had prepared. Her golden hair gleamed in the firelight, washed clean in a stream that afternoon while Mason had kept watch from a respectful distance. Mason poked at the fire. Not much to tell. My family came from Ohio when I was 12. My father had grand ideas about building a cattle empire. And did he? Mason's jaw tightened. No, the West had other plans for him. Jessica studied him across the flames. At 21, she possessed a perceptiveness that made him uncomfortable. Is that why you stay alone, because of what happened to your family? I stay alone because it's simpler, he replied, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. No complications. Yet you complicated your life for me. Her voice held no accusation, only curiosity. Mason shrugged. That's different, you needed help. Once you're safely in Helena with your fiancé, I'll return to my uncomplicated existence. And what does that existence hold for you, Mr. Steele? Just endless cattle drives and sleeping under the stars? The question struck closer to his core than he liked. I'm saving to buy my own land someday, a small ranch, nothing fancy. Alone, the single word carried weight. Mason busied himself with the stew to avoid her gaze. A man needs no company but his own out here. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. My parents died of influenza 3 years ago. Uncle Henry was my only family. Now, her voice faltered. Judge Blackwell's proposal came through correspondence. We've never actually met. Mason looked up sharply. You're traveling to marry a man you've never met. She lifted her chin slightly. It's a practical arrangement. He's 46, respected, established. He needs a wife to manage his household and provide social standing. I need security. And what of love? The question escaped before Mason could check it. A sad smile touched Jessica's lips. Love is a luxury, Mr. Steele. Security is a necessity. Isn't that what the West teaches us? The echo of his own philosophy in her words unsettled him. He'd chosen isolation as protection. She was choosing a loveless marriage for the same reason. The parallel left him strangely disturbed. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We should reach Helena by tomorrow afternoon." That night, Mason lay awake long after Jessica's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The stars overhead seemed to mock his carefully constructed solitude, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different path, one where fear didn't dictate his choices. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Morning brought rain, a steady, soaking downpour that turned the trail to mud and slowed their progress to a frustrating crawl. By midday, they were both drenched despite Mason's canvas slicker, which he'd insisted Jessica wear. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Mason called over the drumming rain. "Used by the cattle outfits during drives. We can wait out the worst there." The abandoned shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry. A small potbelly stove sat in one corner, and Mason quickly got a fire going with the meager supply of wood stacked nearby. Jessica stood shivering by the door, water dripping from her sodden skirts. "You should change into something dry," Mason said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll wait outside." "Don't be ridiculous," Jessica replied. "You'll catch your death, just turn around." "I have a dry dress in my valise." Mason faced the wall, intensely aware of the rustle of fabric behind him. The small space seemed to shrink further, charged with an uncomfortable intimacy neither had anticipated. When she finally told him he could turn, Jessica was wrapped in a simple gray dress, her wet hair loose around her shoulders as she spread her soaked clothing near the stove. "Your turn," she said, facing away from him. "You can't stay in those wet clothes." Mason hesitated, then quickly changed into his spare shirt and trousers, hanging his wet things beside hers. The domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force, their clothing side by side, steam rising in the warm air, the sound of rain creating a world that existed only for them. "Thank you," Jessica said suddenly, still facing the wall, "for finding me, for helping me. I never properly said it." "Anyone would have done the same." She turned then, her expression serious. "No, not anyone. The West is filled with men who take what they want. You're different." The air between them seemed to thicken. Mason took an involuntary step toward her, drawn by something he'd spent years denying. Jessica didn't retreat, her gaze steady on his. The moment shattered at the sound of approaching horses. Mason moved instantly to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 riders approached through the rain, leading a 4th horse, a paint with distinctive markings that Mason recognized immediately. "That's my uncle's horse," Jessica whispered, having joined him at the window. "Those must be the men who—" "Stay inside," Mason ordered, reaching for his Colt. "They haven't seen us yet, maybe they'll pass by." But the riders slowed, examining the fresh hoofprints leading directly to the shack. Mason cursed under his breath. The driving rain should have washed away their tracks, but they'd arrived too recently. "There's nowhere to run," Jessica said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They'll find us." Mason assessed their options with ruthless practicality. 3 against 1 were poor odds in a straight fight. Listen carefully. "I'm going to go out there and try to convince them I'm alone. You hide under that cot in the corner and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Jessica caught his arm. "They'll kill you." "Maybe not." "Men like that are usually cowards at heart." Mason checked his revolver. "If things go badly, wait until they're gone, then follow the creek north. You'll hit the Helena road by nightfall." Before she could argue further, he pressed his spare knife into her hand. "Just in case." Jessica's fingers curled around the knife handle. "Mason." The sound of his given name on her lips nearly undid his resolve. "I'll be right back," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Just a misunderstanding to clear up." Outside, the rain had slackened to a dreary drizzle. Mason stepped onto the muddy ground, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. The 3 riders had stopped 20 yards away, sizing him up with calculating eyes. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Mason called, keeping his hand casual but ready near his holster. "Bad day for traveling." The leader, a hard-faced man with a week's growth of beard, spat tobacco juice into the mud. "That your horse in the lean-to?" "It is." "Traveling alone." Mason shrugged. "Just me and my regrets." The leader exchanged glances with his companions. Thing is, we're looking for a girl, blonde, pretty, ran off after a misunderstanding a few days back. Haven't seen anyone for miles, Mason replied evenly. What kind of misunderstanding leaves a girl running alone in this country? The leader's expression darkened. The kind that ain't your business, cowboy. Mind if we take a look in that shack? Actually, I do mind. I've paid for my privacy with a long, wet ride. The men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. The leader's gaze hardened. That's a mighty particular position for a man outnumbered 3-1. Mason squared his shoulders. I'm a particular kind of man. Check the shack, the leader ordered one of his companions, a weasel-faced youth barely out of his teens. I wouldn't, Mason warned, his hand now openly resting on his revolver. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that often accompanies violence. The leader drew first, but Mason had been anticipating the motion. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth arc, firing twice in rapid succession. The leader jerked backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face as he toppled from his saddle. Mason was already pivoting toward the second man when white-hot pain exploded along his left side. He staggered but managed to squeeze off another shot, catching the older outlaw in the shoulder. The third man, the weasel-faced youth, fired wildly, his bullet splintering the doorframe as Mason dove for cover behind a water trough. Through a haze of pain, Mason heard Jessica scream his name. The sound galvanized him. Breaking cover, he fired at the young outlaw, catching him in the chest. The man collapsed in the mud, his revolver falling unfired from limp fingers. The second outlaw, wounded but still dangerous, was struggling to aim his pistol from where he'd fallen. Mason stumbled toward him, his own gun trained steadily despite the blood soaking his shirt. Don't, Mason warned. For a moment Mason thought the man might surrender. Then the outlaw's eyes shifted, looking past Mason with sudden malice. She was worth the trouble after all, he sneered. Mason didn't need to turn to know Jessica had emerged from the shack. Stay back, he ordered, not taking his eyes from the wounded outlaw. You're bleeding, Jessica's voice came from too close behind him. The distraction was brief, just a flicker of Mason's attention, but it was enough. The outlaw lunged for his fallen revolver. Mason fired instinctively, the bullet striking true. The man collapsed back into the mud, motionless. In the sudden silence, the rain seemed unnaturally loud. Mason turned to find Jessica staring at the carnage, her face pale but composed. Are you hit? He asked urgently. She shook her head. You are. The adrenaline was fading now, and Mason swayed slightly as the pain intensified. Jessica was at his side immediately, supporting him back toward the shack. Just grazed, he managed, though the burning along his ribs suggested otherwise. Inside, Jessica helped him to the cot, her movements efficient despite her trembling hands. Take off your shirt, I need to see how bad it is. Mason complied, wincing as the blood-soaked fabric pulled away from the wound. Jessica's sharp intake of breath told him it wasn't merely a graze. The bullet went through, but it's deep, she said, gathering clean cloths from her valise. This will hurt. Mason gritted his teeth as she cleansed the wound with whiskey from his saddlebag, then bound it tightly with strips torn from one of her petticoats. Where did you learn to do this? He asked, trying to distract himself from the pain. My father was a doctor before we lost everything in the Panic of '73, Jessica replied, her focus on her task. I assisted him sometimes, her hands paused. You saved my life again. Mason met her gaze. They were bad men who needed stopping, with or without you in the equation. Is that why your hand never shook, even after you were shot? Because you've done this before. Mason looked away. The war between the states left many young men with skills they'd rather forget. Jessica finished binding his wound in silence, her touch gentle despite the firmness of her bandaging. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet. Those men recognized my uncle's horse. They knew I was traveling with him. This wasn't random violence. Mason had reached the same conclusion. Your uncle, was he carrying anything valuable, something worth killing for? Jessica hesitated, then moved to her valise. From a hidden pocket, she withdrew a leather pouch. Land deeds. Uncle Henry was bringing these to Judge Blackwell as part of our arrangement, mining claims in the Helena district. Mason's eyes narrowed. Your marriage was the price for those deeds, wasn't it? Color rose in Jessica's cheeks. Judge Blackwell agreed to help us develop the claims if I agreed to become his wife. It was a fair exchange. Fair, Mason couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Selling yourself for financial security. And what would you have me do? Jessica challenged, sudden fire in her eyes. Starve, become a laundress or a saloon girl. Women have precious few options in this world, Mr. Steele, especially women without family or fortune. The truth of her words silenced him. His own choices had been driven by fear. Hers by necessity. Who was he to judge? We should bury them, he said finally, nodding toward the door. Can't leave them for the scavengers. Jessica touched his bandaged side. You're in no condition to dig graves. Then we'll cover them with stones. It's the decent thing. The task took the remainder of the daylight, with Jessica doing most of the work despite Mason's stubborn attempts to help. By the time they'd finished, twilight was settling across the plain, and Mason's wound had begun bleeding again, staining the bandages crimson. You need rest, Jessica insisted, helping him back to the cot. Helena can wait another day. Mason didn't argue. The blood loss had left him light-headed, and the knowledge that they were relatively safe, for now, allowed his body to acknowledge its limits. He drifted into a fitful sleep, vaguely aware of Jessica tending the fire, changing his bandages when necessary, humming softly as she moved around the small space. He woke sometime in the darkest hours, disoriented and burning with fever. Jessica was beside him immediately, her cool hand on his forehead. Easy, she murmured, you're safe. Mason caught her hand, anchoring himself to her touch. Jessica. The Dades are safe, rest now. Need to tell you, his thoughts scattered like startled birds. Your fiancé, not safe. Jessica leaned closer. What about Judge Blackwell? Mason struggled to articulate the suspicion that had been forming in his fever-addled mind. 3 men knew exactly where to find you and your uncle, who knew your route, who knew about the deeds. Understanding dawned in Jessica's eyes. Judge Blackwell arranged our travel schedule. He's the only one who knew we were coming, and why. Cheaper to steal deeds than honor an arrangement, Mason managed before a fresh wave of pain washed over him. Jessica's expression hardened into something like resolve. Sleep now, she said, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. I'll watch over you. Mason wanted to protest, to insist that he was the protector, not the protected, but darkness claimed him before he could form the words. His fever broke sometime the next day, leaving him weak but clear-headed. He awoke to find Jessica asleep in a chair beside the cot, her hand still holding his. The sight created a warm ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Mason gently extracted his hand, causing Jessica to stir and open her eyes. You're awake, she said, relief evident in her voice. The fever's gone. Mason nodded. Thanks to your care, we should get moving, if those men had friends. I've been thinking about that. Jessica straightened, suddenly all business. We can't go to Helena, not directly. If Judge Blackwell is behind this, he'll be watching the roads. We need proof before we make accusations against a sitting judge, Mason cautioned. Jessica nodded. There's a mining surveyor in Virginia City, a friend of my uncle's. He can verify the legitimacy of the deeds. From there, we can decide our next move. Mason studied her face, noting the new determination that had replaced her earlier vulnerability. That's a solid plan. But Virginia City means crossing the mountains. It won't be easy. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Steele. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Besides, I have a rather determined cowboy as my guide. Something had shifted between them, an equilibrium finding balance. No longer rescuer and rescued, but partners facing a common threat. Mason found himself responding to her quiet strength with growing admiration. Virginia City it is, then, he agreed. We'll leave at first light. The journey to Virginia City tested them both. Mason's wound, though healing cleanly, limited his strength. Jessica proved surprisingly resilient, adapting quickly to the rigors of frontier travel. They avoided main trails, taking longer but safer routes through terrain too difficult for casual pursuit. During those days of shared hardship, barriers fell away between them. Around evening campfires, Jessica spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her father's medical practice, and the financial collapse that had left her dependent on her uncle's charity. Mason, to his own surprise, found himself sharing stories he'd told no one, about his mother's gentle wisdom, his father's broken dreams, and his own service in the war. I was 16 when I lied about my age to join the Union Army, he admitted one evening as they camped in a sheltered canyon. Thought I'd find glory, found hell instead. Jessica didn't offer empty consolation, only quiet understanding. Is that when you decided to come west, after the war? Mason nodded, couldn't go home, too many ghosts. My father had already moved on to Montana territory, so I followed. Found him broken in ways that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with losing my mother. And you decided then that love was too dangerous, Jessica observed. The insight startled him. Something like that. Jessica stared into the flames. I made a similar decision after my parents died. Safety first, heart second. That's why Judge Blackwell's proposal seemed sensible. A bitter smile crossed her face. Now it seems I've failed at even the practical path. You haven't failed, Mason said with unexpected intensity. You've survived, there's courage in that. Jessica's gaze met his across the fire. There's more courage in allowing yourself to feel, despite knowing the risks. Something I suspect you understand better than you admit, Mason Steele. The use of his full name, formal yet intimate, sent a ripple of awareness through him. They've been traveling together for nearly 2 weeks now, sharing dangers and confidences, yet maintaining a careful distance dictated by propriety and their uncertain future. We should reach Virginia City tomorrow, Mason said, changing the subject. Your uncle's friend, are you certain he can be trusted? Jessica nodded. Samuel Wilson was my father's classmate at medical school before he turned to geology. He has no connection to Judge Blackwell. Good, we'll need allies if we're going to expose a corrupt judge. The conversation shifted to practical matters, but Mason remained acutely conscious of a growing truth he could no longer deny. Jessica Harlow had breached the walls he'd built around his heart. The realization terrified him more than any outlaw's gun. Virginia City greeted them the following afternoon, its busy streets a shock after days in the wilderness. The mining boomtown hummed with commerce and vice in equal measure, saloons and brothels standing alongside mercantiles and assay offices. Jessica drew curious glances in her travel-worn dress, a respectable woman being a relative rarity in such places. They found Samuel Wilson at the assay office, a bespectacled man in his 50s, whose initial professional reserve dissolved into genuine grief when Jessica explained her uncle's fate. He ushered them into his private office, away from curious ears. Henry was bringing these to Judge Blackwell. Wilson examined the deeds with expert attention. These are legitimate and extraordinarily valuable. Recent surveys indicate the richest silver deposits in the territory lie within these boundaries. Valuable enough to kill for? Mason asked. Wilson's expression turned grim. Without question, the Silver Bell mine alone would be worth hundreds of thousands. Jessica exchanged a meaningful look with Mason. We believe Judge Blackwell may have arranged my uncle's death to gain these deeds without honoring our arrangement. Wilson removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. Thomas Blackwell has a reputation for ruthless business dealings, but murder is a significant escalation. You'll need more than suspicion to challenge a man of his standing. What if we had one of the men who attacked us? Mason asked. If he testified that Blackwell hired them. That would certainly strengthen your case, but I think I wounded one of them badly enough that he might not have made it back to Helena, Mason explained. If we could find him, persuade him to testify. Wilson shook his head. Too dangerous. Blackwell has allies throughout the territory. I suggest we approach this more carefully. He turned to Jessica. These deeds are legally yours now, as Henry's only living relative. My recommendation is to register them immediately with the Territorial Land Office here in Virginia City, before Blackwell can make any claim. Won't that alert him to our location? Jessica asked. Possibly, but it secures your legal position. From there, we can build a case against him through proper channels. Mason bristled at the caution in Wilson's approach. While we're following proper channels, Blackwell could send more men after Jessica. I'm well connected in this community, Wilson assured them. You'll both stay at my home under my protection while we resolve this matter. The offer was generous and sensible. Yet as they followed Wilson to his comfortable home on the hillside above town, Mason couldn't shake his unease. Something about the surveyor's confidence felt misplaced against the ruthlessness they'd already encountered. Wilson's housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett showed Jessica to a guest room, while Mason was given a small chamber that had belonged to Wilson's son before he'd left for university back east. After weeks of camping, the clean sheets and private accommodations should have been welcome luxuries. Instead, Mason found himself pacing, restless with foreboding. When a soft knock came at his door shortly after midnight, he wasn't surprised to find Jessica in the hallway, equally sleepless. "May I come in?" she whispered. "Just to talk." The impropriety should have concerned him more than it did. Mason stepped aside, leaving the door partially open for the sake of her reputation. "You don't trust Wilson's plan either," she said, taking a seat in the room's single chair while Mason leaned against the windowsill. "It's too passive. Blackwell won't wait for legal proceedings if he learns you're alive and have the deeds." Jessica nodded. "I've been thinking the same. What do you suggest?" Mason had been considering options since their arrival. "We register the deeds as Wilson suggested, but we don't stay here afterward. We take the evidence we have to the federal marshal in Helena, bypass territorial authorities entirely. That means returning to the very place Blackwell has the most influence." "Yes, but on our terms, not his. We arrive unannounced, present our evidence directly to federal authorities." Mason hesitated. "It's still risky." Jessica studied him in the lamplight. "You don't have to come with me. You've already done more than anyone could ask." The suggestion that he might abandon her now felt like a physical blow. "I'm seeing this through," he said firmly. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." Something shifted in Jessica's expression, a softening, a recognition. "Why, Mason, your life would be simpler if you'd never found me crying by that creek. Why risk everything for someone who was a stranger 3 weeks ago?" The question demanded honesty he denied even to himself. Mason looked away, gathering courage for a truth he'd spent years avoiding. "Because you made me remember what it feels like to care about something more than my own survival," he admitted quietly. "And once remembered, I can't seem to forget." Jessica rose from the chair, moving to stand before him. "I was to marry a man I'd never met for security and social standing. Now I find I can't imagine such a life." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not after knowing you." The current between them, denied for weeks, suddenly became unbearable. Mason reached for her hand, a gesture both restrained and intimate. "Jessica, when this is over." A crash from downstairs shattered the moment. Mason instantly pushed Jessica behind him, drawing his revolver. Voices rose from below, angry, demanding. Through the open window came the sounds of more men surrounding the house. "Blackwell's men," Jessica whispered. "They've found us." Mason cursed himself for letting down his guard. "The window, we need to go now." A gunshot echoed from below, followed by Wilson's voice raised in alarm. Jessica hesitated, torn by concern for their host. "We can't help him if we're captured too," Mason urged. "This way." The rear window opened onto a short drop to a sloped roof. Mason went first, then helped Jessica down. They scrambled across the moonlit shingles to where a trellis offered a route to the ground. Behind them, boots thundered up the stairs toward their empty rooms. They fled into the darkness, keeping to shadows and back alleys as shouts of alarm spread through Virginia City. Mason led them to the livery stable where they'd left their horses, grateful they hadn't yet unsaddled them fully. "What about the deeds?" Jessica asked as they hastily prepared to ride. Mason handed her the leather pouch he'd kept on his person. "Never let them out of my sight. Some instinct told me to keep them close." Within minutes they were riding hard out of town, taking the northern trail toward Helena. Behind them, lanterns bobbed like fireflies as search parties organized. "They'll expect us to avoid Helena now," Mason said when they paused to rest the horses. "That's why we need to go there directly. Confront Blackwell before he can consolidate his position." Jessica nodded, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. "How did they find us so quickly?" The question had been troubling Mason as well. Wilson must have sent word to someone, deliberately or accidentally. "I can't believe he would betray us intentionally. He was my father's friend." "Loyalty can be complicated out west," Mason replied grimly. "Especially when silver's involved." They rode through the night, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. By dawn, they'd crossed the mountain pass and were descending toward the Helena Valley. The territorial capital sprawled before them, substantial buildings of brick and stone announcing its prosperity from the mining wealth that had built it. "We need to find the federal marshal before Blackwell learns we're here," Mason said as they approached the outskirts. "Keep your head down. We'll stable the horses at the edge of town and proceed on foot." Jessica touched his arm. What if the marshal is also in Blackwell's pocket? The possibility had occurred to Mason as well. "Then we go to the newspaper. Make the allegations public, force an investigation." They left their horses at a small livery on the eastern edge of town, paying extra for the stableman's discretion. As they walked toward the center of Helena, Mason was acutely aware of their conspicuous appearance, trail-worn and exhausted, Jessica still in her dusty traveling dress. The federal marshal's office occupied a solid brick building near the courthouse. Mason hesitated at the door, suddenly conscious of how flimsy their evidence might seem against a respected judge's word. "Second thoughts?" Jessica asked quietly. Mason shook his head, "Just considering how to present our case most effectively." The office was empty save for a deputy who regarded them with bored indifference. "Marshal Donovan's at the courthouse, trial today." "When will he return?" Mason asked. The deputy shrugged. "Could be hours. Judge Blackwell's presiding and he likes to run a thorough court." Jessica tensed beside him at the mention of Blackwell's name. Mason thanked the deputy and guided her back outside. "The courthouse," Jessica said with grim determination. "We go directly to where he is, confront him publicly." "That's dangerous," Mason cautioned. "If he's as corrupt as we believe, he won't hesitate to have us arrested on false charges." "Do you have a better suggestion? Every hour we wait gives him more time to discover we're here." She was right, Mason realized. They'd reached the point where bold action offered better odds than cautious delay. The Helena courthouse dominated the town square, its imposing stone facade and domed roof declaring the authority of territorial law. As they climbed the steps, Mason felt Jessica's hand slip into his, a gesture of mutual courage that tightened his resolve. Inside, the main courtroom bustled with activity. A trial was indeed in progress, with Judge Thomas Blackwell presiding from his elevated bench. He matched the photograph Jessica had shown Mason, gray-haired, stern-faced, radiating authority in his black robes. They slipped into seats at the back of the gallery. The case appeared to involve a dispute between mining interests, with teams of lawyers arguing technical points of claim boundaries. "We wait until there's a recess," Mason whispered. "Then we approach the marshal, not Blackwell directly." Jessica nodded, her gaze never leaving the judge who had arranged her uncle's murder and her own intended fate. For an hour they sat through the legal proceedings, the tension building as they waited for their opportunity. Finally, Blackwell called for a midday recess. As the courtroom began to empty, Mason spotted Marshal Donovan, a weathered man with a silver mustache and the alert eyes of a career lawman. They approached him just as he was exiting through a side door. "Marshal Donovan, my name is Mason Steele. This is Miss Jessica Harlow. We need to speak with you on a matter of federal concern." Donovan assessed them with professional caution. "What sort of matter?" "The murder of Henry Harlow and conspiracy to steal mining claims," Mason replied in a low voice. "We have evidence implicating Judge Blackwell." The marshal's expression revealed nothing. "That's a serious accusation against a federal appointee. Follow me." He led them to a small anteroom adjacent to the courtroom. As Mason began to explain their situation, the door behind them opened. Judge Blackwell himself entered, flanked by two deputies. "Marshal, I was told you were meeting with—" Blackwell stopped abruptly, his gaze fixing on Jessica with momentary shock before his features composed themselves. "Miss Harlow. We'd received word of your uncle's tragic death. I'm relieved to see you survived." The performance was masterful, concern perfectly modulated, surprise appropriately contained. Had Mason not known better, he might have believed the judge's sincerity. Jessica straightened her spine. "Judge Blackwell, I believe you arranged to have my uncle murdered for his mining claims." Blackwell's expression hardened. "That's an outrageous accusation from a young woman clearly suffering from trauma and exhaustion." He turned to Donovan. "Marshal, Miss Harlow has endured a terrible ordeal. She needs medical attention, not an interrogation." "We have evidence," Mason interjected. The deeds Judge Blackwell was so eager to acquire, testimony about the men who attacked their wagon, men who specifically targeted Miss Harlow and her uncle. Donovan glanced between them, his expression unreadable. These are serious allegations that require investigation. Of course, Blackwell agreed smoothly, and they will be thoroughly investigated, but first, I believe Miss Harlow should be placed under protective custody for her own safety. The man who murdered her uncle may still be at large. Mason recognized the strategy immediately. Once in custody, Jessica could be silenced, evidence suppressed, the narrative controlled. Miss Harlow stays with me, he said firmly. Blackwell's mask slipped momentarily, revealing calculated malice. And who exactly are you, Mr. Steele, a convenient rescuer who now refuses to relinquish his charge to proper authorities? One might question your motivations. My motivations, Mason's temper flared. I'm not the one who arranged to have a man killed for his property. Marshal, Blackwell said with judicial authority, I believe Mr. Steele should be detained for questioning regarding Henry Harlow's murder. His presence at the scene and subsequent flight with Miss Harlow raised troubling questions. The trap was closing around them. Mason's hand moved toward his revolver, stopping when he saw the deputy's hands do the same. No one is detaining anyone without proper cause, came a new voice from the doorway. All eyes turned to find Samuel Wilson standing there, accompanied by a distinguished man in an expensive suit whom Mason didn't recognize. Governor, Blackwell acknowledged, his confidence visibly shaken. This is an unexpected pleasure. The territorial governor nodded curtly. Judge Blackwell, I've just had a most illuminating conversation with Mr. Wilson regarding certain mining claims and a suspicious murder. Marshal Donovan, I believe federal oversight of this investigation is warranted, given the allegations against a sitting judge. Mason looked to Wilson in confusion. The surveyor offered a slight smile. Did you think I betrayed you? The men who came to my home were not Blackwells. They were claimed jumpers who'd learned of the deed's value through other channels. I came directly to Helena to alert the governor, an old friend from legislative days. The revelation shifted the balance of power in the small room. Blackwell's carefully constructed authority began to crumble as the governor took control of the situation. The deeds, Miss Harlow, the governor requested. Jessica produced the leather pouch, handing it to Donovan rather than directly to the governor, a small but significant indication of where she placed her trust. Marshal, please secure Judge Blackwell in your office while we sort this matter out, the governor directed. No formal arrest yet, but I want him available for questioning. Blackwell's face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. You have no evidence beyond the hysterical claims of a traumatized woman and her protector. Actually, Wilson interjected, one of the men who attacked Miss Harlow's wagon was apprehended this morning, attempting to sell a distinctive watch that belonged to Henry Harlow. Under questioning, he proved quite willing to implicate his employer. Mason exchanged a look of startled hope with Jessica. The trap they'd feared had become Blackwell's instead. The next hours passed in a blur of statements, depositions, and formal complaints. By evening, Judge Thomas Blackwell had been officially removed from the bench pending investigation, and a federal prosecutor had been dispatched from Salt Lake City to handle the case. The governor provided them rooms at Helena's finest hotel, with a deputy posted outside for security. For the first time since finding Jessica by the creek, Mason allowed himself to believe they might actually be safe. After dinner in the hotel restaurant, their first proper meal in weeks, they retreated to a quiet corner of the lobby. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more statements, the beginning of a legal process that might take months to resolve. What will you do now? Mason asked, the question that had been building in his mind finally finding voice. The deeds are legally yours. You're a wealthy woman, Jessica. She studied him across the small table, lamplight catching the gold in her hair. Wealth without purpose seems empty. I was thinking of establishing a clinic in my father's memory. Helena could use more medical services. That's a worthy ambition. A small smile touched her lips. And what of the cowboy who saved me? Will you return to your uncomplicated existence now that your duty is fulfilled? The question cut to the heart of the transformation Mason could no longer deny. The man who had found Jessica crying by the creek no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had remembered how to hope, how to connect, how to risk the vulnerability he'd spent years avoiding. I was thinking, he said carefully, that silver mines need security, protection from claim jumpers and such. Are you offering your services, Mr. Steele? I might be if the owner were amenable. Jessica's expression softened. And what of that ranch you mentioned, the land you were saving for? Still a dream worth pursuing. Mason hesitated, then decided truth was the only offering worthy of what had grown between them. But dreams change, evolve. The ranch I imagined before was a fortress against the world. Now I find myself picturing something different. What do you picture? Her voice had dropped to a near whisper. Mason met her gaze directly. A home. Not just a place to exist in isolation, but somewhere to build a life, perhaps. A shared life, if someone were willing to take that risk with me. Jessica reached across the table, her fingers finding his. I believe I know someone who might be persuaded. Someone who's learned that security isn't found in arrangements or fortresses, but in choosing to face life's uncertainties with the right partner. Mason turned his hand to clasp hers, a promise in the simple touch. It won't be easy. The West makes no guarantees. I don't want guarantees, Jessica replied, just your promise that we'll face whatever comes together. That, Mason said, is a promise I can keep. Montana Territory, 1880. The Silver Bell Ranch stretched across the rolling foothills outside Helena, its white-painted farmhouse gleaming in the spring sunshine. From the wide front porch, Jessica Steele watched her husband of 3 years riding in from the eastern pasture, their 2-year-old son balanced securely before him in the saddle. Mason still carried himself with the alertness of a man who had known danger, but the rigid guardedness that had once defined him had softened into something more nuanced, a protective awareness that embraced life rather than defended against it. As they approached, little Henry waved excitedly. "Mama, we saw buffalo." "Did you now?" Jessica descended the porch steps to meet them, accepting her son as Mason lowered him carefully into her arms. "Just the one old bull," Mason clarified, swinging down from his horse, wandering alone along the ridge. "Like someone else I once knew," Jessica said with a meaningful smile. Mason's eyes crinkled at the corners as he bent to kiss her. Not anymore. The promise made in a Helena hotel 3 years earlier had been kept. Together they had built something neither could have imagined alone, the ranch that was home to their growing family, the clinic in town where Jessica treated patients 3 days a week, the mining interests that had made them prosperous but not changed the simplicity they valued. "The Wilsons are coming for supper," Jessica reminded him. "Samuel wants to discuss expanding the clinic." Mason nodded, leading his horse toward the barn. "I'll be cleaned up in time." "Got a letter from Marshal Donovan today. Blackwell's appeal was denied. He'll serve his full sentence." Justice had been slow but thorough. The former judge would spend 20 years in prison for his crimes, his web of corruption fully exposed in a trial that had captivated the territory. Later that evening, after their guests had departed and young Henry was asleep, Mason and Jessica sat together on the porch swing, watching stars emerge above the land they'd made their own. 3 years ago today," Jessica mused, leaning against his shoulder, "you found me crying by a creek and promised to help me reach Helena." "Best detour I ever took," Mason replied, his arm tightening around her. "Though at the time, I thought it a terrible complication to my carefully ordered life." Jessica laughed softly, and now. Mason turned to her, the moonlight catching the love in his eyes that he no longer tried to hide. "Now I understand what my father never could. That love isn't a weakness on the frontier. It's the only thing that makes the hardship worthwhile." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a reminder of the wildness that still surrounded their haven. But within the circle of Mason's arms, Jessica found the truth they had discovered together, that sometimes the bravest act on the frontier wasn't facing danger alone, but choosing to build something lasting in a land where nothing was guaranteed. "I'm glad you found me crying," she whispered. "I'm glad you let me stay," he answered, sealing the sentiment with a kiss that held the promise of all the years still to come.